Acts 16, verse 11 says this: "So setting sail from Troas, we made a direct voyage to Samothrace, and the following day to Neapolis, and from there to Philippi, which is a leading city of the district of Macedonia and a Roman colony. We remained in the city some days, and on the Sabbath day we went outside the gate to the riverside, where we supposed there was a place of prayer. And we sat down and spoke to the women who had come together. One who heard us was a woman named Lydia, from the city of Thyatira, a seller of purple goods, who was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to pay attention to what was said by Paul. And after she was baptized, and her household as well. She urged us, saying, 'If you have found me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house and stay.' And she prevailed upon us." In these 4 or 5 verses is a beautiful snapshot of the book of Acts, where the gospel of Jesus begins to sweep the Mediterranean and the Roman world and Africa and beyond. And there's so much in this little passage. God was already pursuing Lydia. She was a worshiper of him. She ends up, most scholars believe, hosting the house church, which becomes what we think of as the Philippian church. She ends up interacting most certainly with the woman in the story after this who had a demon expelled from her, and then with the Philippian jailer who was a Roman soldier. About Luke and Acts is they are the longest books in the New Testament. People often think of Paul as writing 2/3. That's numerical books, number of words. Luke wrote 2/3 of the New Testament in the book of Luke, the account of Jesus, in the book of Acts, the spread and founding of the early church. And in so doing, we find out a lot about Luke, and it helps us to trust the book of Acts, even with the questions that it gives us. He was incredibly accurate with respect to the governing parts of the Mediterranean, of Asia Minor, of Europe, and of the Middle East. When he says the district of Macedonia, Roman colony, Philippi, which is a leading city. His description of these things probably involved both talking with Paul, talking with Barnabas, talking with Lydia, talking with others in Philippi. And she's baptized, and people like me want to know more about that conversation. And her household as well. And all of us want to know more about that conversation. But the purpose of the book of Acts is to show us the spread of the early church from this frightened and unsure group of people who had met the risen Christ and who were commissioned to go and make disciples of all nations, to it reaching Rome and Asia Minor, and perhaps even the westernmost parts of Europe and Africa, and not recorded in the book of Acts except indirectly, getting all the way to India in its first generation. And it's because the Holy Spirit was spreading over the earth. The message was always for all of the earth, but the nations were not coming to Israel for all sorts of reasons. You can read your Old Testament to find out. And so God was sending his people to the nations to teach them about the gospel of God, that in Jesus they receive forgiveness of sins and new life in the Holy Spirit. At the end of Acts chapter 16, Paul and Silas, I said Barnabas earlier, Silas were in prison, and they were praying and singing, and the prisoners were listening to them, because our hymns are as much part of our witness as anything else that we do. And there's an earthquake. The doors were open, and everyone's bonds were unfastened, and the jailer woke, and he was going to take his own life, because that's how serious he took his job, and that's how serious Rome took his job, but they were all there. And then the magistrates were scared and said, "Let them go." And Paul said, "No, we're not leaving. You beat us uncondemned." And there's a public apology, which is reminding us how detailed Luke was in his account. And they came and apologized to Paul and Silas, and they took them out and asked them to leave the city. And then in verse 40 it says, "So they went out of the prison and visited Lydia, the new convert. And when they had seen the brothers, as in the other Christians in Philippi, they encouraged them and departed." One of the most beautiful parts of the New Testament is the interconnectedness, if we will but pay attention to it and study it and then be encouraged by it. The gospel of God is unthwartable in its pursuit of God's people.